I think much more widely assumed to be the common European framework is the self-assessment grid. Because this does summarize the levels in relation to the receptive skills of listening and reading, the productive or speaking skills, rather, of spoken interaction, spoken production, and writing. Now, I wouldn't claim I can read that, but you can see how that descriptor for B1 contains elements from the longer, all-embracing attempt at a descriptor for B1 on the global scale. I think it's easy to assume that they started with a global scale, and then they expanded that into a self-assessment grid, and then for the various descriptors in the self-assessment grid, they expanded into the so-called illustrative scales. In fact, it went the other way around. Brian North did the empirical work to validate the scales that I'm going to go through in this screen, and then, as he said, got very sore eyes eyeballing all the descriptors and gradually coming up with the summaries in the self-assessment grid and the global scale. First of all, then, we've got these 34 so-called illustrative scales for different dimensions of listening, reading, spoken interaction, spoken production, and writing. But those behavioral scales are complemented by 13 scales of linguistic competence and language quality. For example, I think these are the first four. There's the general linguistic range, vocabulary range, vocabulary control, grammatical accuracy, and 9 more. And there are 7 strategic scales, the first 3 being planning, compensating, and monitoring and repair. Now, on the whole, the fact that we've got those 3 kinds of scales is ignored. And far too many people don't appreciate that in order to do these levels justice, one's got to constantly bring the behavioral scales, the scales that say what you can do communicatively with the language at different levels, into interaction with the scales of linguistic competence and quality, language quality, and the strategic scales. That happens very rarely. It's not just scales either. What page 1 tells us the CEFR does is describes in a comprehensive way what language learners have to do in order to use a language for communication, and what knowledge and skills they have to develop so as to be able to act effectively. Act effectively, action-oriented approach, of course. So besides presenting those scales of 3 different kinds, we have taxonomic and discursive treatment of all those things. Context of language use, communication themes, communicative tasks and purposes, communicative language activities and strategies, communicative language processes, texts, user-learners' competencies, language learning and teaching, tasks and their role in language teaching, linguistic diversification in the curriculum, and assessment. And you can see there that there is a certain amount of implied overlap from one to the other. But remember that these Council of Europe documents and tools and resources are developed by groups of people drawn from across the member states, coming from different traditions, each with particular bees in their bonnet, which they want to allow to buzz as loudly as possible in the finished product. I shouldn't labour the point too much, but I mean, you'll understand that the eyes of certain members of the validation committee rise heavenwards in silent prayer as soon as I say anything that contains autonomy or autonomous. 2 points that I think it's very important to bear in mind is, first of all, that the action-oriented approach gives us a way of bringing curriculum, pedagogy and assessment into closer interrelation than has traditionally been the case. Because each can-do descriptor can serve as a curriculum target. It can also, at the same time, serve as a criterion for selecting or developing learning activities and materials. And you can take it as a starting point for the elaboration of assessment criteria. To me, that's the challenge of the CEFR. And that's the challenge that, on the whole, ministries of education are failing to notice, never mind respond to. We tried to do it, and I think we did it rather successfully in Ireland in relation to ESL in our school system, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. But bringing curriculum, pedagogy and assessment into interaction with one another and doing it in such a way as to involve the learner, because learners understand these can-do descriptors. That's the key. The second thing that's far too often not appreciated is that the CEFR is language independent. It's not intended to be a specification for English or French, depending on which of the canonical versions you read. Neither is the translation into German meant to be a specification for German, and so on and so forth across the 33 plus languages into which it's been translated. So that using it always entails elaboration in terms of a particular language. Some of you are probably already familiar with the French référentiel. Do you know these things that are published by Didier and attempt to expand on the different levels? Anyone know Profile Deutsch? Which is a book, but more importantly a CD-ROM, a sort of interactive tool. English Profile. Do you know English Profile? This is a massive undertaking, coordinated, I think it's probably fair to say, by Cambridge ESOL, but with many partners. What they're doing is analysing presumably millions of exam papers from around the world in relation to the different levels of exams that they offer, and exploring what progressions in terms of SLA-type development they can uncover. And the research that one of my students has been doing in Ireland is effectively a mini version of that.